A woman who keeps loving a dead man ain't a woman anymore. Thomas Grady said loudly enough for the entire church hall to hear, and the laughter that followed rolled through Black Hollow like dry thunder across empty plains. Clara Whitmore did not look up. She stood near the back wall beneath the flickering oil lamps, dressed in the same black wool dress she had worn every Sunday for the last 3 years, her gloved hands folded tightly at her waist as though holding herself together by force alone. The room smelled of cedar smoke, wet leather, and fresh bread cooling on long wooden tables prepared for the harvest social. But none of it touched her. Nothing ever seemed to touch Clara anymore. Men had tried. Lord, they had tried. Some came carrying flowers wrapped in ribbon from Denver. Some offered silver bracelets or polished horses with expensive saddles. One widower had even promised her half his land near Dry Creek if she agreed to remarry before winter. Clara refused every one of them with the same quiet nod and those same distant gray eyes that never stayed on a face long enough to invite hope. People stopped calling her beautiful sometime during the 2nd year after her husband died. Instead, they called her strange, cold, haunted, and out in places like Black Hollow. A woman living alone without smiling at men made folks nervous. She sleeps beside his grave more than she sleeps inside that house. Another voice muttered near the punch table. Ain't natural. Clara heard every word. She always did. But she never defended herself anymore because grief had exhausted her long ago. Fighting people took energy. Breathing already felt heavy enough. Reverend Hale cleared his throat awkwardly near the center of the hall, pretending not to hear the whispers spreading from table to table. Outside, wind scraped dust across the church windows in long dry sighs. Somewhere in the distance, thunder murmured over the hills even though the sky had been clear at sundown. Storm coming. Clara knew storms well. They carried memories into rooms where memories weren't welcome. Thomas Grady stepped closer with the confidence of a man too rich to be embarrassed by cruelty. His boots shined black beneath the lantern glow, and the gold watch chain stretched proudly across his vest. You can keep pretending forever, he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound intimate, while making sure everyone still heard him. But the truth is simple. A woman alone out here won't survive forever. Clara finally lifted her eyes. Not angry, not wounded, just tired. That somehow made the room even quieter. I already survived the worst thing that could happen to me, she said softly. The rest don't scare me much. A few women shifted uncomfortably. Thomas forced a smile, but something sharp flashed behind his eyes. Men like him hated quiet answers because quiet answers made them feel loud. You know what your problem is? He asked. You keep waiting for a ghost to walk back through your front door. Clara's fingers tightened against the black fabric of her gloves. For half a second, something inside her face cracked open. Pain. Real pain. Raw enough to silence even the cruelest mouths in the room. Then it disappeared again behind that cold stillness she wore like armor. Without another word, she turned toward the church doors. No one stopped her. Nobody ever did. The hall watched her walk out into the cold evening air alone, the heavy wooden doors creaking shut behind her. And that should have been the end of it. Another lonely night. Another walk home beneath empty stars. Another evening sitting beside the untouched chair on her porch. But out beyond the hitching posts near the edge of the churchyard, a man sitting quietly on a dark horse had heard every single word Thomas Grady said. Elias Mercer rested one hand loosely over the saddle horn while wind moved slowly through his coat. He had arrived nearly 20 minutes earlier, but never stepped inside. Folks around Black Hollow were used to that. Elias rarely entered crowded places unless he absolutely had to. Some claimed he disliked people. Others swore he carried something broken inside him from the border wars years ago. Children whispered that he had once shot 3 cattle thieves without blinking. Old Martha Reed said that was nonsense because no man who fed stray dogs during winter could be. Truly cruel. Truth was, nobody knew much about Elias Mercer at all. He lived alone nearly 15 miles north of town, near the Cottonwood Ridge where the grass turned silver at dawn. He sold cattle twice a season, fixed his own fences, spoke little, drank less, never married, never courted anyone. And somehow, despite his silence, every person in Black Hollow lowered their voice slightly whenever he walked past. Elias watched Clara descend the church steps slowly, one gloved hand gripping the railing as wind tugged loose strands of dark hair across her face. She looked smaller than people remembered. Grief did that. It carved pieces away quietly where nobody could see. Thomas Grady burst from the church behind her with a laugh still hanging in his throat, eager to perform cruelty a little longer while people watched. "You hear me, Clara," he called. "Dead men don't come home." Several men chuckled nervously from inside the doorway. Clara stopped walking but did not turn around. The wind sharpened suddenly, carrying dust across the empty street between her and the church. And that was when Elias Mercer finally moved. Slowly, calmly, he swung down from his horse without taking his eyes off Thomas Grady. Boots touched dirt with a low thud. Silence spread strangely fast across the churchyard. Thomas noticed him too late. Elias said nothing at first. He simply stepped forward until the lantern light caught the hard lines of his weathered face. Tall, broad-shouldered, quiet as winter timber. Thomas tried to grin. "Evenin', Mercer." Elias looked past him toward Clara standing alone near the road. Then he spoke in that low, steady voice people remembered long after conversations ended. "Some folks," he said quietly, "talk loud because they're afraid silence might tell the truth about him." Nobody laughed this time. Thomas's smile stiffened. The wind carried another distant rumble of thunder across the valley. Clara turned slightly then, just enough to glance toward Elias for the first time in nearly a year since her husband's funeral. Their eyes met only briefly, but something shifted in the cold air between them. Small, fragile, dangerous. Then Clara looked away and continued walking into the dark road leading home while Elias Mercer stood alone beneath the church lanterns watching her disappear into the night. The Whitmore house sat nearly half a mile outside Black Hollow where the cotton fields gave up and dry prairie began. Folks used to say the place looked beautiful in springtime back when lanterns glowed warm behind the windows and music drifted from the porch after supper. Now people rode past it quickly without looking too long because grief changes a house same as it changes a person. It drains color from things. Clara Whitmore climbed the porch steps slowly with dust clinging to the hem of her black dress while cold wind rattled the dead vines wrapped around the railing. The empty chair beside the front door waited exactly where it always waited. Nobody in town dared touch that chair anymore. Not after the first year. Men who came courting usually made the mistake of sitting there while trying to convince Clara to move on with her life. None of them returned a second time. She never shouted, never caused scenes. She would simply stand in the doorway looking at the chair until the man eventually stood back up feeling foolish without understanding why. Because that chair had belonged to Daniel Whitmore, her husband. Every evening for 11 years he had sat there at sunset, drinking coffee black as coal dust while Clara read aloud from old newspapers or stitched blankets beneath the lantern glow. Some nights they hardly spoke at all. They just listened to crickets and watched the sky fade purple beyond the wheat fields. Then one autumn morning Daniel rode east with 2 supply wagons during a storm and never came home again. The river crossing north of Miller Creek had swallowed horses, cargo, and 3 men before sunrise. They found pieces afterward. A broken wagon wheel, torn canvas, Daniel's hat lodged between river rocks 20 miles downstream. But no body. Never a body. That was the cruel part. A grave without certainty leaves the door inside a person half open forever. Clara stepped inside the house and lit the oil lamp hanging near the kitchen shelf. Soft amber light pushed shadows back only a few feet before. Darkness swallowed the rest again. The house smelled faintly of cedarwood and old coffee grounds. Everything remained exactly where Daniel left it 3 years earlier. His boots still rested near the back wall beside the wash basin. His coat still hung behind the door. Even his pipe remained untouched atop the mantel, though dust had gathered thick along the carved wood beneath it. Old Martha Reed once begged Clara to put those things away. "You are preserving pain," she had said gently over tea one winter afternoon. Clara remembered staring into her cup before answering quietly, "Pain is all I have left that still belongs to him." After that, Martha stopped asking. Clara removed her gloves carefully and placed them beside the sink. Her hands looked thinner than they used to. Everything about her looked thinner now. Grief feeds on people slowly. Not enough to kill them quickly, just enough to hollow them out one season at a time. Outside, thunder rolled again farther across the plains. Rain smell drifted faintly through cracks around the windows, though the storm had not yet arrived. Clara crossed toward the front room and froze. For a moment her tired mind played tricks on her, because she thought she saw someone sitting in Daniel's chair out on the porch through the curtains. Her pulse stumbled painfully against her ribs. Then lightning flashed far away beyond the fields, and the porch turned empty again. She closed her eyes tightly. "Fool woman," she whispered to herself. But the loneliness inside that house had grown dangerous lately. Dangerous in quiet ways people never noticed. She had started hearing phantom footsteps near dawn. Started waking some mornings convinced she smelled Daniel's tobacco drifting from empty rooms. Sometimes grief becomes so large it begins making sounds of its own. Clara moved toward the bookshelf near the fireplace where an old photograph rested, turned halfway from sight. She stared at it without touching it. Daniel standing beside her beneath summer sunlight years ago, smiling crookedly beneath his hat while one arm wrapped around her waist. Back then she still wore blue dresses. Back then her laughter came easily enough that neighbors heard it through open windows. She barely recognized that woman anymore. A sharp knock suddenly echoed against the front door. Clara stiffened instantly. Nobody visited after dark unless something was wrong. The second knock came slower this time. Calm. Steady. She reached automatically for the lantern and stepped toward the window, first instead of the door. Careful. Always careful now. Through the curtain, she saw a tall figure standing quietly beneath the porch roof while wine tugged dust around his boots. Elias Mercer. He held his hat loosely in one hand. No flowers. No whiskey bottle. No smile practiced for charm. Just silence. Clara frowned slightly in confusion because men only came to her house for 3 reasons anymore. Pity, desire, or loneliness disguised as kindness. Something told her Elias Mercer carried none of those tonight. She opened the door only halfway. Cold wind slipped immediately into the room carrying rain scent and distant thunder. Elias looked tired beneath the porch lantern. Not weak. Just weathered in the way lonely men become after too many winters spent speaking mostly to horses and fences. Neither of them talked for several seconds. The silence stretched strangely comfortable between them. Finally, Clara spoke first. "If you came to apologize for what happened at church, save your breath." Elias shook his head once. "Did not come for that." His voice stayed low and rough like boots dragging across gravel roads. Clara waited. Men usually rushed to fill silence around her because silence frightened them. Elias did not. He simply glanced once toward the empty chair beside the door before looking back at her. "Then why are you here?" she asked quietly. Wind moved across the porch. Somewhere nearby a loose shutter knocked softly against wood. Elias lowered his eyes briefly toward the lantern glow spilling across the floorboards. "Truth." Clara nodded once. He looked back up at her then, and for the first time since Daniel disappeared beneath that river 3 years ago, another human being said something to Clara Whitmore that did not sound like pity. House looked too quiet. Something inside her chest shifted painfully at those words because they were simple, honest, and somehow far more dangerous than compliments. Clara tightened her grip slightly on the edge of the door. "You should go home before the rain starts." Elias glanced toward the dark horizon where lightning flickered silently behind distant clouds. Probably, but he did not move. Neither did she. The empty chair beside the porch remained untouched between them while thunder rolled slowly across Black Hollow like a memory refusing to die. Rain finally came an hour after Elias Mercer left Clara Whitmore standing in her doorway with confusion sitting heavy behind her eyes. The storm rolled over Black Hollow slowly at first, dragging curtains of silver rain across the prairie while thunder shook window panes loose in old homes along the valley. Clara barely slept that night. Not because of the storm. Storms had stopped frightening her long ago. It was the sentence that stayed with her. House looked too quiet. Strange how a few simple words could crawl deeper beneath the skin than grand speeches ever could. Most men spoke to impress women. Elias Mercer spoke like a man who only opened his mouth when silence became heavier than words. Clara sat awake beside the kitchen lamp listening to rain strike the roof while shadows moved softly across the walls around her. Twice, she almost rose to remove Daniel's coat from behind the door. Twice, she stopped herself halfway across the room. Dawn arrived gray and cold. The storm left the prairie soaked beneath low clouds drifting like smoke over the hills. Clara stepped outside carrying a tin bucket toward the well when she noticed fresh wagon tracks cutting through mud near her fence line. Deep tracks. Heavy wheels. Somebody had come by before sunrise. She frowned slightly and looked toward the porch. A small wooden crate rested beside the empty chair. Clara approached cautiously. No note. No markings. Inside sat 3 glass oil lanterns wrapped carefully in cloth beside 2 extra bottles of lamp fuel. New. Expensive too. Clara stared silently at them while Wind lifted loose strands of dark hair across her face. She already knew who sent them. Only one man in Black Hollow noticed things. Without announcing it afterward, by noon, the entire town somehow knew Elias Mercer had visited Clara Whitmore's house. Small towns carried information faster than prairie fires. Martha Reed pretended not to gossip while serving coffee at the bakery, but she listened harder than anyone. Sheriff Boone Callahan heard about it from the barber before breakfast. By afternoon, even stable boys near the feed store whispered about the quiet rancher finally losing his mind over the widow in black. He sat on Daniel Whitmore's porch. One ranch hand muttered in disbelief. Man has got a death wish. Another shook his head slowly. No. Worse. He has got patience. Meanwhile, Elias Mercer spent the morning repairing fence posts north of Cottonwood Ridge beneath skies still heavy with rain clouds. His ranch stretched lonely across nearly 40 acres of rough land where wind never seemed to stop moving. Most men hated working property that isolated. Elias preferred it. Silence out there felt honest. Cattle did not ask questions. Fences did not lie. The only sounds were hammer strikes, creaking leather, and distant hawks circling over open grass. Around midday, Sheriff Boone rode up the muddy trail toward the ranch house with his coat collar raised against the cold. Elias barely glanced up while tightening wire around a cedar post. Town is talking, Boone said after dismounting slowly. Elias kept working. Town usually does. Boone sighed. You know what I mean. Elias drove another nail carefully into wood before finally straightening. Rainwater darkened the shoulders of his coat. You come all the way out here to discuss gossip? Boone studied him quietly for a long moment. They had known each other nearly 15 years. Long enough for Boone to recognize when Elias carried something serious beneath that calm expression. Thomas Grady is angry, Boone said carefully. Man does not like feeling embarrassed. Elias wiped mud from his gloves. That sounds like Thomas Grady's burden. Boone lowered his voice. Clara Whitmore already has enough trouble breathing without the whole town climbing onto her porch too. That finally earned a look from Elias. Not angry, just steady. I did not climb onto her porch. No, Boone admitted quietly. That is exactly why folks cannot stop talking about it. Wind swept across the ridge carrying wet grass, smell through the silence between them. Somewhere beyond the pasture, cattle lowed softly near the creek bed. Boone eventually shook his head. You know what scares people most about you, Mercer? Elias returned to the fence wire. No. You never seem to want anything. Boone mounted his horse again slowly. Men trust hunger. They understand greed. But a man with no visible appetite makes people nervous. Elias said nothing. Boone tipped his hat and rode away through the mud while thunder murmured faintly again beyond the hills. That evening, Clara Whitmore lit one of the new lanterns just before sunset. Warm golden light filled the front room softer than the older lamps she owned. She hated herself slightly for noticing how beautiful it looked. The flame reflected gently across Daniel's photograph near the fireplace, and for the first time in months, the house did not feel entirely abandoned. Clara sat quietly near the window listening to crickets beginning outside after the rain. Then came another knock at the door. Calm. Steady. Exactly once. Her heartbeat stumbled before she could stop it. Clara opened the door slower this time. Elias stood there beneath fading evening light, holding his hat against his chest, while dust still clung to his boots from the long ride into town. You forgot to leave your name on the lanterns, Clara said softly before she could think better of it. Something almost resembling amusement flickered briefly across Elias Mercer's tired face. Almost. Figured you would know. Silence settled again. Comfortable somehow. Dangerous in that same quiet way. Clara glanced toward the empty chair beside the porch. Then back at him. You planning on standing there all evening? Elias looked toward the horizon where sunset spread copper light across soaked prairie fields. Depends. On what? His eyes met hers steadily. Whether the house still feels too quiet. Clara should have closed the door then. Should have protected the careful distance she spent 3 years building around herself. But loneliness is a strange thing out on the frontier. Leave it alone long enough, and eventually even silence begins sounding like company. She stepped aside just enough for lantern light to spill across the porch boards. Elias Mercer looked once toward the empty chair beside hers before lowering himself into it slowly for the first time since Daniel Whitmore vanished beneath floodwater 3 years earlier. And somewhere deep inside the old house, something broken shifted softly awake again. If you have made it this far into the story, leave a comment below and let me know where you are watching from tonight. And do not forget to like the video if you believe some people can change a life simply by staying. The first evening Elias Mercer sat beside Clara Whitmore on the porch. Neither of them spoke for nearly 20 minutes. Sunset spread slowly across the prairie in long bands of copper and faded blue while crickets sang through wet grass still heavy from yesterday's storm. Somewhere beyond the hills, cattle bells clinked softly in the wind. Clara sat stiff in her chair with both hands wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee that had long since gone cold. Elias leaned back slightly beside her, hat resting across one knee, eyes fixed on the horizon like a man studying weather only he could see coming. It should have felt uncomfortable. Two lonely people sitting together in silence usually invited awkwardness. But somehow the quiet between them felt different. Not empty, just careful, like two strangers standing near the edge of frozen lake ice, both listening for cracks beneath their feet. Clara glanced sideways at him once while pretending to adjust the lantern wick. Elias had not looked directly at her since sitting down. Most men stared too hard when speaking to women. Elias Mercer behaved like a man afraid eye contact might accidentally become a promise. "You always this talkative?" Clara finally asked softly. A faint breath escaped him that might have been the closest thing to laughter she had heard from another person in years. "Depends who is asking. That's supposed to be an answer?" "Best one I got." Clara shook her head slightly and looked back toward the fields. The corner of her mouth nearly moved upward before she caught herself. Nearly. Wind stirred across the porch, carrying scent of wet earth and distant cedar smoke drifting from neighboring ranches. Night settled slowly over the valley, while lantern light painted warm gold across the weathered porch boards beneath their boots. Clara realized something strange then. For the first time since Daniel disappeared, she was not counting minutes waiting for somebody to leave her alone. That realization frightened her more than loneliness ever had. Inside the house, the old grandfather clock ticked softly through open windows. Elias noticed the sound first. "Clock runs slow," he said quietly. Clara frowned slightly. "What?" "About 4 minutes behind." She stared at him with surprise because he was right. Daniel used to adjust the clock every Sunday evening after supper. Since his death, Clara had never bothered fixing it. "How did you notice that?" Elias shrugged once. "My mother had the same clock." Clara studied him carefully then. "You had a mother?" The question slipped out before she realized how foolish it sounded. Another faint, almost smile crossed his face. "Last I checked." Clara lowered her eyes into her coffee cup, embarrassed. "Sorry. No harm done." Silence settled again. Softer now. Easier somehow. Then Clara asked the question half the county had wondered for years. "Why do you live alone out there?" Elias rubbed one rough thumb slowly across the brim of his hat before answering. "Peace and quiet mostly." Clara looked around the empty porch. Funny place to visit then. This time she definitely caught the corner of his mouth twitching slightly before he looked away toward the horizon again. "Guess I am branching out." The sound surprised her. Not his voice. Her own laughter. Small. Barely more than breath. But real enough that both of them noticed it immediately. Clara stopped instantly after hearing herself. Her chest tightened painfully. Guilt arrived fast and sharp. How could she laugh while Daniel lay somewhere beneath cold river water miles away? The joy vanished from her face so quickly it felt like a door slamming shut. Elias noticed. Of course he noticed. But unlike other men, he did not rush to comfort her. Did not tell her she deserved happiness. Did not try filling pain with speeches. He simply sat there beside her while darkness deepened around the porch. Sometimes restraint feels kinder than sympathy. Finally Clara spoke again, voice quieter now. "People in town think I am strange." Elias nodded once. "People in town think rain means God is angry. That is not the same thing." "Close enough." Clara stared at the lantern glow flickering between them. "You do not seem scared of me." Elias looked genuinely confused by that. "Should I be? Most folks are." He thought about it a moment. "No," he said finally. "Most folks are scared of grief because they think it spreads." Those words landed deep. Clara felt them settle somewhere painful inside her ribs. She looked down quickly before he could see her eyes shining in the lantern light. Nobody had ever described it that way before. Spread. Like weather. Like winter cold moving through a valley one ranch at a time. The porch grew colder as night settled fully across Black Hollow. Elias eventually rose from his chair slowly and placed his hat back onto his head. I should head back before the roads turn to mud again, he said. Clara nodded, though disappointment brushed unexpectedly against her chest. Strange. She had spent 3 years wanting everyone to leave her alone. Now silence suddenly felt heavier when he stood up. Elias moved toward the porch steps before stopping halfway down. He looked back once toward the lantern beside her chair. Lantern suits the house better than darkness did. Then he walked toward his horse without waiting for an answer. Clara watched him disappear down the road beneath pale moonlight, while wind moved softly through the fields around the house. Long after the hoofbeats faded, she remained sitting there beside the empty chair Daniel once used, and the chair Elias Mercer had finally dared to occupy. And for the first time in years, Clara Whitmore forgot to feel alone for nearly an entire evening. By the fourth evening, people in Black Hollow had started timing Elias Mercer's visits to Clara Whitmore's house like church bells. He arrived just before sunset every night. Never earlier. Never late. The same dark horse. The same dust-covered boots. The same quiet knock against the front door that somehow sounded gentler than any voice Clara had heard in years. Folks noticed patterns out on the frontier because patterns were easier to understand than loneliness. And nobody understood what was happening between the widow and the rancher. That frightened them more than they cared admitting. Clara noticed the staring first when she rode into town for supplies 2 mornings later. Conversations lowered the moment she stepped inside the general store. Women suddenly became fascinated with canned peaches and flour sacks, while men near the stove stopped mid-sentence pretending not to look at her. Even the clerk avoided meeting her eyes while wrapping coffee beans in brown paper. Clara stood stiff beside the counter, feeling heat rise beneath her collar despite the cold autumn air drifting through the doorway. Before Daniel died, Black Hollow treated her kindly. People waved from wagons. Children brought flowers to her porch. Women invited her for sewing circles and church socials. But grief changes the way towns look at a woman. At first they pity her. Then they grow uncomfortable. Then eventually they become angry when sorrow refuses to leave on schedule. "You hear Mercer has been riding out there every night?" somebody whispered near the canned goods aisle. "Maybe she finally got tired of mourning." Another voice answered softly. "Or maybe he likes broken things." Clara gripped the coffee package tighter without turning around. Words like that used to wound her deeply. Now they simply exhausted her. She paid for her supplies quickly and stepped back outside into the pale morning sunlight, where wagons creaked slowly across muddy streets left behind by last week's storm. She had almost reached her horse when Thomas Grady appeared beside the hitching post wearing that polished smile rich men practiced in mirrors. "Morning, Clara." She kept adjusting the saddle straps without looking at him. "Mr. Grady." "Folks are talking," he said lightly. "Small towns do that." Clara finally raised her eyes. Then perhaps they should find bigger things to occupy themselves with. Thomas chuckled softly, though irritation flashed beneath it. "You know Mercer is making you look foolish." That earned a pause. Clara straightened slowly beside the horse. "How so?" Thomas slipped his thumbs beneath his vest pockets. "Man sits on your porch every evening like a stray dog waiting for scraps, and the whole county watches it happen." Clara's face remained calm, but something cold settled behind her eyes. "Interesting," she said quietly. "I was under the impression the porch belonged to me." Thomas leaned closer slightly, lowering his voice. "You really think a man like Elias Mercer visits because he cares?" Clara stared at him silently. "Men like that only know loneliness. They cling to the nearest wounded thing they find." The wind moved between them, carrying dust along the street. For half a second Thomas seemed confident she might believe him. Then Clara spoke in that same soft voice that somehow always sounded sharper than shouting. "Funny," she said. "He has sat beside me 4 nights now and never once tried controlling what I should feel." Thomas's smile faded. Clara mounted her horse before he could answer and rode away through town beneath dozens of watching eyes. Meanwhile, Elias Mercer spent the afternoon repairing storm damage near his barn while cold wind pushed dark clouds slowly across the hills again. Around sunset, he washed dust from his hands at the water pump before changing into a clean work shirt still faded from years of hard use. He moved slowly, deliberately, like a man preparing for something important without admitting it to himself. Old Martha Reed spotted him riding through town shortly afterward and nearly dropped an entire tray of peach pies onto the bakery floor. Mercer cleaned his boots. She whispered dramatically to Sheriff Boone, who happened to be drinking coffee nearby. Boone glanced through the window at the rancher passing quietly down the street. "Good Lord," he muttered. "The man really has lost his mind." Martha folded her arms proudly. "I told you loneliness eventually catches everybody." Boone shook his head slowly while watching Elias disappear down the road toward Clara's ranch. "No," he said after a moment. "That is not what this looks like." Clara heard the hoofbeats before the knock came. Strange how quickly the body learns somebody's rhythm once they become expected. She stood at the kitchen sink staring out the darkening window while lantern light flickered warmly across the room behind her. Daniel's coat still hung untouched near the door. His boots still rested beside the wash basin. But lately the house no longer felt frozen in time every second of the day. That frightened Clara almost as much as it comforted her. The knock came. Calm. Once. She opened the door before he could knock again. Elias stood there holding a small paper package tied with rough string. "Store clerk said you forgot this," he explained quietly, handing it toward her. Clara looked down in surprise. Cinnamon tea leaves. Her favorite before Daniel died. She had not purchased any in nearly 3 years. "I did not forget these," she said carefully. Elias nodded once. "I know." Clara stared at the package for several long seconds. "Then why buy them?" Elias shifted slightly beneath the porch lantern glow. "Because you looked at them twice before leaving." The answer struck her harder than compliments ever could have. Not because of the tea. Because somebody had noticed her wanting something again. Clara stepped aside slowly from the doorway. Elias glanced once toward the empty chair beside hers before sitting down quietly, like he belonged nowhere else at sunset. Neither spoke for several minutes. Wind moved gently through the prairie grass while lantern light flickered across the porch ceiling above them. Then Clara finally asked the question sitting inside her mind since church night. "Why me?" Elias looked toward the dark horizon where stars slowly appeared one by one beyond drifting clouds. "Truth. Truth." He rested his forearms loosely against his knees before answering. "Because every person in this town talks at you." His eyes shifted toward her then. "Steady. Honest. You looked like somebody waiting for one person willing to sit still long enough to hear you instead." Clara lowered her eyes quickly toward the untouched tea package resting in her lap, because suddenly the porch felt too small for the ache growing quietly inside her chest. Autumn settled deeper over Black Hollow during the weeks that followed, painting the prairie in faded gold and long shadows that stretched across the valley before supper time. Every evening, just before sunset, Elias Mercer rode the same lonely road toward Clara Whitmore's house, while townsfolk watched from windows pretending they had better things to do. He never missed a day. Not when cold rain swept across the hills. Not when northern wind carried frost sharp enough to sting the lungs. And somehow, without either of them meaning for it to happen, the silence on Clara's porch slowly became part of both their lives. Some evenings they hardly spoke more than 10 words. Other nights conversation drifted slowly between them like smoke from an old campfire. Small things mostly. The weather. Fence repairs. Which trees would lose leaves first before winter. Yet beneath those ordinary words sat something larger neither dared name aloud. Trust grows quietly out on the frontier. Like grass after drought. Slow enough you barely notice until one morning the whole field has changed color. Clara began leaving a second coffee cup on the porch table before Elias arrived. She told herself it was simply manners. Nothing more. But she noticed if he came late enough for the coffee to cool. Elias noticed too, though he never mentioned it. One cold evening the wind carried the smell of snow from the mountains nearly 80 miles west. Clara sat wrapped in a dark wool blanket while lantern light glowed softly beside her chair. Elias rested both hands around a steaming cup of coffee, staring toward the distant hills. "First snow comes early this year," he said quietly. Clara nodded. Daniel used to say snow always finds lonely houses first. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Usually when she mentioned her husband, people either became uncomfortable or rushed to change the subject. Elias didn't either. He simply listened. Clara looked down toward the lantern flame flickering between them. He loved winter. She continued softly after a while. Said cold weather made the world honest because nobody could hide how much they needed each other. Wind rattled dead leaves across the porch floorboards. Elias lowered his eyes slightly toward the coffee in his hands. Smart man. Clara studied him carefully. You never talk much about your own people. Elias leaned back slowly in his chair. Not much to tell. Everybody has something to tell. He remained quiet long enough that Clara assumed the conversation had ended. Then finally he spoke. Had a younger brother once. Something inside his voice changed when he said it. Barely noticeable, but real. Clara sat still, waiting. Name was Samuel. Elias continued quietly. Talked enough for both of us. A faint shadow of memory crossed his face beneath the lantern glow. Could make strangers laugh inside 5 minutes. Clara smiled softly at the image. You loved him very much. Elias nodded once. Still do. The wind moved harder through the prairie grass beyond the porch. Clara noticed his hands tighten slightly around the coffee cup before relaxing again. What happened to him? She asked gently. Silence stretched between them, long enough for crickets to fill the empty spaces. Then Elias answered in the same low, steady tone he used for everything difficult. Border fire near Red Canyon, 12 years ago. Clara felt her chest tighten immediately because every person living out west knew stories from Red Canyon. Smoke, chaos, men disappearing into flames and dust while supply wagons burned through the night. Elias stared toward the dark horizon while speaking as though the memory sat somewhere far away beyond the hills. Samuel got trapped helping pull injured men from a collapsed stable. His jaw tightened once before continuing. Roof gave way before I could reach him. Clara lowered her eyes slowly. I am sorry. Elias shrugged faintly, though grief flickered quietly behind his expression. Folks kept calling me brave afterward. He gave a dry, almost laugh without humor. Truth is, I spent years wondering if I should have dragged him out sooner instead of helping strangers first. Clara understood that feeling immediately. The guilt survivors carry. The endless bargaining with memory. The impossible habit of replaying old moments, searching for different endings that never existed. That is the cruel thing about losing somebody, she whispered. Your mind starts building doors that were never really there. Elias looked toward her then, directly, fully. It startled her how seen she felt beneath that steady gaze. You still wait for him at night, do not you? He asked quietly. Clara's breath caught. Nobody had ever said it aloud before. But yes, sometimes she still woke at midnight convinced she heard Daniel's boots on the porch steps. Sometimes she still glanced toward the road at sunset expecting a rider to appear through the dust. Grief makes fools out of hope long after reason gives up. Clara stared down at her hands folded tightly in her lap. Part of me knows he is gone, she admitted softly. The other part keeps listening for hoofbeats anyway. Elias nodded slowly like a man who understood too well. Nothing foolish about that. Clara looked toward him again, eyes shining faintly in the lantern light. Most people think there is. Elias rested his forearms against his knees before speaking. Most people fear pain they cannot fix. Those words settled deep into the cold night air around them. Clara realized then why sitting beside Elias felt different from sitting beside anyone else in Black Hollow. He never treated grief like weakness. Never tried curing it. He carried his own quietly enough to recognize hers without judgment. The porch fell silent again except for wind moving through dry grass and the soft crackle of lantern flame between them. Yet the silence no longer felt empty. It felt shared. Somewhere deep inside Clara Whitmore, a locked door shifted open another inch. And somewhere inside Elias Mercer, a man who spent years believing loneliness was safer than attachment, began forgetting what complete solitude felt like. Far out across the dark prairie, the first snow of the season started falling softly beneath the moonlight. And if you are still here listening beside these two lonely souls tonight, thank you for spending part of your evening with this story. Snow arrived heavy 3 nights later. Not the gentle kind that drifted soft as feathers across open prairie. This storm came hard and sideways with northern wind sharp enough to cut through coats and freeze water troughs solid before midnight. By sundown, Black Hollow had already vanished beneath curtains of white swirling across the valley like ghosts searching for old roads. Clara Whitmore stood near the front window, tightening her shawl around her shoulders while the storm battered the house with steady force. The lantern flames flickered uneasily against the walls each time wind rattled the windows. She kept glancing toward the road without meaning to. Foolish habit. Dangerous habit. Yet as darkness deepened outside, part of her still listened for hoofbeats beneath the storm. He will not come tonight, she told herself quietly. No sane man would ride 15 miles through weather like this simply to sit in silence beside a widow. But another part of her already knew Elias Mercer was not like most men in Black Hollow. The clock ticked slowly through the front room. 8 o'clock came and passed. Then 9. Snow piled thick against the porch railings while icy wind moaned through cracks in the walls. Clara finally moved toward the fireplace, kneeling carefully to add another log when she heard it. 3 soft knocks against the front door. Calm. Steady. Exactly the same as always. Her breath caught painfully in her chest. Clara opened the door, and winter immediately exploded into the room, carrying snowflakes and bitter cold air. Elias stood on the porch beneath a layer of snow, dusting his shoulders and hat brim white. His horse waited near the fence, barely visible through the storm. Roads are nearly buried, Clara said before she could stop herself. Elias brushed snow from one glove slowly. Noticed that. She stared at him in disbelief. You rode through this? Took longer than usual. Clara shook her head softly, as though trying to understand something impossible standing in front of her. Why? Elias glanced once toward the empty chair beside the porch wall before answering. Said I would come by this evening. The simplicity of the answer struck harder than grand romantic speeches ever could have. Clara stepped aside silently, allowing warmth and lantern light to spill across the porch boards. Elias entered carefully, removing his hat near the doorway while melting snow dripped quietly onto the floorboards beneath his boots. For the first time since Daniel died, another man stood fully inside Clara Whitmore's home after dark. The realization made her heartbeat unsteady. Elias noticed the hesitation in her face immediately. I can stay on the porch if you prefer, he said quietly. Clara looked around the lonely room lit soft gold by lantern glow. Daniel's coat still hung behind the door. The untouched pipe still rested above the fireplace mantel. Yet somehow the house no longer felt entirely trapped inside old sorrow tonight. Porch is half buried in snow, she answered softly. You would freeze. Elias shrugged faintly. Been cold before. Clara almost smiled despite herself. That was not permission. A small silence passed between them before she finally nodded toward the kitchen table. Sit down before you bring half the storm into my house. Elias obeyed quietly, moving with the same carefulness he always carried around her grief. Never pushing, never assuming welcome. Clara poured fresh coffee while wind screamed outside hard enough to shake the windows. Neither spoke much at first. The storm filled the silence for them. Snow scratched against the glass. Timber groaned softly beneath northern gusts. Somewhere outside, loose fence chains clattered in the dark. Clara placed a steaming cup before him and sat across the table instead of retreating toward the fireplace like usual. Another small thing. Another dangerous thing. Elias wrapped rough hands around the warm coffee cup while lantern light flickered gently across his weathered face. Town will probably assume scandal by morning, Clara murmured quietly. You inside the house after dark. Elias took a slow drink before answering. Town assumes scandal if 2 people breathe near each other longer than necessary. Clara lowered her eyes, hiding another faint smile. Then lightning flashed white through the windows, followed almost immediately by thunder so sharp it rattled the dishes inside the cabinet. Clara flinched before she could stop herself. Not because of storms. Because for one terrible instant the sound dragged her backward through memory. River water. Wind. Men shouting Daniel's name somewhere beyond darkness she could not reach. Her breathing tightened. Elias noticed immediately. Of course he did. But again, he did not smother her with sympathy. He simply sat there quietly until her breathing steadied again. Storms still bring it back? He asked gently after a while. Clara stared into the coffee untouched in her hands. Sometimes I still hear them knocking on my door the morning they came to tell me. Her voice grew quieter. I remember staring at the mud on their boots before they even spoke. Elias listened without interrupting. Part of me knew already, Clara whispered. You can feel certain kinds of loss coming before words arrive. Wind hammered the house again. Lantern flames trembled softly. Elias finally set his cup down. Samuel used to hate storms too, he said quietly. Clara looked up. Your brother? He nodded once. Said thunder sounded like God dragging furniture across heaven. Clara let out a soft, surprised laugh before covering her mouth instinctively, like she had forgotten how the sound worked. Elias looked at her then. Not startled. Not pitying. Just calm. There it is, he said softly. Clara frowned slightly. What? Your laugh. The room fell still around them. Even the storm outside seemed distant for half a second. Clara lowered her eyes quickly toward the table because suddenly something fragile and terrifying moved inside her chest. She had spent 3 years preserving grief so carefully she forgot joy could survive beside it. Elias leaned back slightly in his chair, watching lantern light dance across the walls while snow continued swallowing the world outside. You do not have to stop being alive to prove you loved somebody, he said quietly. Clara felt tears burn suddenly behind her eyes. Not loud tears. Not dramatic ones. Just the quiet kind lonely people carry when somebody finally says the thing they needed most. The snowstorm trapped Elias Mercer at Clara Whitmore's house. Until nearly dawn, roads disappeared beneath drifts taller than fence posts, and northern wind screamed across the prairie hard enough to shake the old windows through the night. Yet inside the small farmhouse, warmth gathered quietly around lantern light, coffee steam, and the strange comfort of not being alone. Clara had forgotten what that felt like. Somewhere after midnight, she stopped sitting across from Elias and moved to the rocking chair nearer the fireplace while he remained at the kitchen table polishing melted snow from his boots with an old cloth. Neither noticed how natural the silence between them had become. Outside, winter buried the world. Inside, something gentler slowly thawed. Clara watched firelight flicker across Elias's weathered face while shadows moved softly behind him on the walls. You always stay this calm during storms? She asked quietly. Elias glanced toward the windows rattling beneath heavy wind. Storm does not care whether I panic or not. Clara shook her head slightly. That sounds miserable. Practical. Same thing sometimes. Another faint, almost smile touched the corner of his mouth. Clara had started recognizing those small expressions now. Most folks in town believed Elias Mercer never smiled at all. Truth was he simply smiled the way lonely men often did. Briefly, carefully, like happiness might disappear if noticed too quickly. The fire crackled softly between them. Clara wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders and stared into the flames for a long while before speaking again. Do you ever get tired of being alone? The question hung quietly in the room. Elias leaned back in his chair, considering it seriously instead of brushing it aside. Sometimes, he admitted after a while. But solitude gets easier once people disappoint you enough. Clara lowered her eyes. Someone disappointed you badly. Elias stared into the firelight. Life mostly. Clara almost answered with something sharp. Something defensive. But exhaustion loosened honesty inside her tonight. I used to think if I stayed sad long enough, she whispered softly, then somehow Daniel would know I never stopped loving him. Elias listened, without interrupting. That sounds foolish when I say it aloud. No, he said quietly. Sounds human. Wind slammed against the house suddenly hard enough to make the lantern flames tremble. Clara flinched instinctively again. This time Elias noticed something else too. Her eyes moved immediately toward the front door. Watching it. Waiting. Fear sat there beneath the movement. Deep. Old. You still expect somebody to knock and tell you they made a mistake, Elias said gently. Clara's throat tightened because that was exactly it. Every storm. Every unexpected sound after dark. Part of her still imagined strangers standing outside, holding impossible news in their hands. Daniel found alive. Daniel returned. Daniel coming home. Grief keeps impossible doors unlocked long after reason abandons them. Clara looked down quickly, ashamed, tears burning behind her eyes. I hate that part of myself. Elias shook his head once. Do not. She frowned faintly. Why? He rested his rough hands loosely against his knees before answering. Because hope is the last thing sorrow takes from a person. The room fell still again except for the soft crackling fire. Clara felt tears slip quietly down her cheek before she could stop them. Not dramatic tears, just tired ones. She turned away quickly toward the fireplace, embarrassed by her own weakness. But Elias did not stare, did not rush closer, did not offer pity disguised as comfort. Instead, after several quiet seconds, she heard his chair scrape softly against the floorboards. Then footsteps crossing toward the kitchen shelf. Clara wiped her eyes quickly, expecting awkward sympathy. Instead, Elias returned holding 2 clean coffee cups. Figured we might as well drink something warm while the world freezes outside, he said simply. Clara let out a small breath that almost became laughter again. And somehow that kindness hurt more than grand gestures ever could, because he saw her pain clearly without trying to own it. Hours passed slowly after that. They spoke about small things. Samuel's terrible harmonica playing when he was younger. The time Daniel accidentally flooded half the chicken coop trying to repair a broken water pump. Clara admitted she once burned an entire peach pie so badly even stray dogs refused it. Elias confessed he could not dance despite multiple failed attempts during his 20s. You? Clara asked with genuine surprise. The mysterious rancher of Cottonwood Ridge. Elias nodded solemnly. Absolute disaster. Clara laughed softly into her coffee cup, while snow continued falling beyond the windows. The sound startled both of them again. Not because it was loud, because it sounded alive. Real. Near dawn, the storm finally weakened enough for the wind to settle into long, tired sighs across the prairie. Pale blue light slowly crept through the windows, while fire embers glowed softly red inside the hearth. Elias stood near the doorway, pulling on his coat. Clara watched him quietly from beside the fireplace, suddenly aware how empty the house would feel once he left. Dangerous thought. Very dangerous. Elias opened the front door, and cold morning air drifted inside, carrying the clean, sharp smell of fresh snow nearly 3 feet deep across the valley. His horse waited near the porch rail, half covered in white frost. Clara stepped closer without fully realizing she had moved. Road will still be difficult, she said softly. Elias nodded while settling his hat onto his head. I will manage. He started toward the porch, then paused when Clara spoke again behind him. Elias. He turned slightly. Clara hesitated. Strange how difficult simple honesty becomes after years spent hiding from it. Finally, she lowered her eyes and whispered, Thank you for staying. Silence rested gently between them. Elias studied her for one long, quiet moment, while cold dawn light touched the edges of falling snow around the porch. Then he answered in that same calm voice she had started carrying inside her thoughts long after nights ended. Did not feel right leaving you alone with the storm. And somehow Clara Whitmore understood he was no longer talking only about winter. After the storm passed, Black Hollow woke beneath a world buried in white silence. Snow-covered rooftops, fences, wagon paths, and empty fields stretching all the way toward the distant mountains. Smoke curled slowly from chimneys while townsfolk shoveled paths through drifts waist-deep, muttering about hard winters arriving too early this year. But inside Clara Whitmore's house, something stranger than snow had settled quietly over the rooms. Warmth. Not loud warmth. Not happiness exactly. Just the faint feeling that the house had remembered how to breathe again. Clara noticed it first the next evening when she lit the lanterns before sunset. For 3 years she had moved through the house like a caretaker guarding a memory instead of a woman still alive. Every room remained untouched. Every object preserved exactly where Daniel left it. But now small things had begun changing without her permission. She caught herself humming softly while sweeping ash from the fireplace. She opened curtains during daylight instead of hiding behind shadows until evening. Yesterday, she even moved Daniel's boots slightly aside while cleaning near the wash basin. The moment she realized what she had done, guilt hit hard enough to stop her breathing. She stared at those boots nearly 10 full minutes afterward, like she had betrayed something sacred. Grief is cruel that way. It convinces people suffering is proof of loyalty. Late that afternoon, Clara rode into town for supplies while snow crunched beneath the horses' hooves. The streets looked brighter beneath winter sunlight, but the stairs followed her same as always. Only now they carried curiosity instead of pity. Martha Reed spotted her through the bakery window and nearly burst outside before Clara could escape. You look different, Martha announced immediately, flour dust still clinging to her apron. Clara frowned. That sounds dangerous. You are standing straighter. Martha lowered her voice dramatically. And your eyes do not look half dead anymore. Clara blinked in surprise before glancing away toward the snowy street. That is a terrible compliment. Still true. Martha softened slightly then. He is good for you. Clara's chest tightened instantly because she knew exactly who Martha meant. Nothing is happening, she answered too quickly. Martha folded her arms knowingly. Honey, in small towns people notice when lonely folks stop. Looking lonely. Clara left the bakery with warm bread tucked beneath one arm and unease twisting quietly through her chest. Because Martha was right about one thing. Things were changing. And change frightened Clara more than sorrow ever had. Halfway toward the feed store, she heard Thomas Grady's voice drifting from beside the saloon porch. "Careful now," he drawled loudly enough for nearby men to hear. "Winter storms make people desperate enough to mistake company for love." Clara stopped walking slowly. Snow drifted across the street between them, while several ranch hands shifted awkwardly near the hitching posts pretending not to listen. Thomas leaned casually against a wooden post wearing his expensive wool coat and polished boots untouched by mud. "You know what folks are saying?" he continued. "That Mercer finally found himself a widow lonely enough not to notice how broken he is." Clara felt anger rise cold and sharp beneath her ribs. Not because Thomas insulted Elias. Because part of her feared he might be right. Elias carried loneliness like old scars beneath his skin. So did she. What if all this was nothing more than two broken people hiding from silence together? Thomas stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly. "Men like Elias Mercer do not know how to love women, Clara. They just know how to sit beside pain because they carry too much of their own." The words struck harder than Clara expected because somewhere deep inside, she had already wondered the same thing. She rode home early that evening with snow clouds gathering again beyond the hills. By sunset, the sky had turned pale gray while cold winds swept across the prairie carrying the promise of another storm. Clara lit the lantern slowly, her thoughts restless and tangled. Thomas's words kept circling through her mind no matter how hard she tried pushing them away. Men like Elias Mercer do not know how to love women. She hated herself for caring what Thomas thought. Yet fear has strange ways of disguising itself as reason. What if she had mistaken kindness for something deeper? What if Elias only came because lonely people recognize loneliness in each other? And worst of all, what if she had started needing his presence too much already? The knock came just after sunset. Calm, steady, familiar enough now that her heartbeat answered it automatically. Clara opened the door slowly. Elias stood there carrying fresh wood beneath one arm, snow dusting his coat shoulders lightly beneath fading evening light. "Road near Miller Creek froze over," he said quietly while stepping onto the porch. "Figured your firewood stack might run low by tomorrow." Clara looked at the neatly cut cedar logs in his arms. Practical, thoughtful, simple. The ache inside her chest tightened painfully again. "You do not have to keep finding reasons to come here," she said suddenly. Elias paused. The wind moved softly through the porch railing between them. "Did not realize I needed excuses." Clara lowered her eyes briefly. "People are talking." Elias remained still for several seconds. "People always talk. This is different." He studied her carefully then. Not angry, not defensive, just listening the way he always did. Clara forced herself to continue. "Thomas says maybe we are only keeping each other company because we do not know how to be alone anymore." Silence settled over the porch. Snowflakes drifted slowly through the fading light around them. Elias looked down once at the firewood in his hands before answering quietly. "And what do you think?" Clara opened her mouth, but no words came. Because the truth terrified her. She thought about waiting for his knock every evening. About laughing again beside the fire during the storm. About the way silence no longer crushed her chest when he sat nearby. She thought about how empty the house felt whenever he rode away. Elias stepped no closer. Did not demand answers. He simply stood there beneath the cold winter sky, while lantern lights spilled softly across the porch boards between them. Finally, Clara whispered the only honest thing she had left. "I think losing this scares me almost as much as losing Daniel did." Something shifted inside Elias's expression then. Small, painfully gentle. He set the firewood quietly beside the porch wall before speaking in that same low, steady voice that always seemed to reach places inside her no one else could touch. "Clara," he said softly, "you do not have to punish yourself every time life tries handing you something warm again." Winter settled fully over Black Hollow after that night. Snowbanks rose along fences taller than wagon wheels, and mornings arrived wrapped in silver frost that turned the valley quiet as a church before sunrise. Yet despite the cold, people in town found fresh energy for gossip every time Elias Mercer's horse appeared on the road leading toward Clara Whitmore's house. Some whispered kindly, others cruelly. Most simply watched because lonely stories gave small towns something to hold during long winters. Clara tried ignoring them. Truly she did. But words have ways of slipping beneath doors no matter how tightly people shut them out. One afternoon while buying flour at the general store, she overheard two women near the fabric shelf speaking softly enough to sound polite and loudly enough to wound. "Mercer sits there every evening and still has not touched her hand," one murmured. "Maybe he is scared of ghosts too." The other laughed quietly. "Or maybe he knows she still loves a dead man more than any living one." Clara kept staring at the flour sacks stacked near the counter while heat rose painfully beneath her collar. She hated how deeply those words cut, because part of her feared they were true. She did still love Daniel. She always would. Yet every evening now, when sunset painted the prairie gold beyond the porch, another part of her waited for the sound of Elias's horse approaching through the cold. The two feelings lived side by side inside her chest, confusing and impossible. By the time Clara rode home that evening, snow clouds had already begun gathering low over the hills again. Wind carried sharp ice through the air, while distant fence posts disappeared slowly beneath drifting white powder. Clara stepped inside the house and paused immediately. The silence felt different tonight, restless somehow. Her eyes moved instinctively toward the empty chair beside the fireplace where Elias usually sat whenever storms forced him indoors. Dangerous habit, she thought bitterly. Dangerous woman. She spent the next hour trying to distract herself with chores, sweeping ashes, folding blankets, rearranging shelves that did not need rearranging. Yet every few minutes, she still glanced toward the window watching dusk settle across the prairie. Then finally came the knock. Calm, steady, familiar enough now that her heartbeat answered before her feet moved. Clara opened the door and found Elias standing there holding a small cloth bundle beneath one arm, while snow drifted softly around him. "Roads are freezing over again," he said quietly. "Thought your chicken coop might need extra feed before morning." Clara stared at the bundle in his hands. Feed grain. Enough for nearly 2 weeks. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. Nobody had looked after small details for her since Daniel died. "You keep doing that," she murmured softly. Elias frowned slightly. "Doing what?" "Finding things before I realize I need them." Wind moved between them, carrying snowflakes through lantern light. Elias looked briefly toward the porch railing before answering. "Guess lonely people learn to notice what gets neglected." Clara lowered her eyes because the sentence sounded painfully true. She stepped aside silently, and Elias entered the warm glow of the house, while snow melted quietly from his coat. Supper that night was simple. Bread, stew, black coffee. Yet somehow the small kitchen table no longer felt haunted while another person sat across from her. Elias spoke little as always, but his silence carried warmth instead of emptiness. Halfway through the meal, Clara noticed him glancing occasionally toward the old photograph resting atop the mantel. Daniel Whitmore smiling beneath summer sunlight with one arm around her waist years ago. "He looked kind," Elias said quietly after a while. Clara followed his gaze toward the picture. Her chest tightened softly. "He was." Silence settled briefly between them before she added, "He made every room feel lighter." Elias nodded once. "That is rare." Clara studied him carefully across the lantern glow. "You are not jealous talking about him." Elias seemed genuinely confused by the idea. "Why would I be? Most men would." He leaned back slightly in his chair, rough. Hands wrapped around a coffee cup gone nearly cold. "Daniel mattered to you. That does not threaten me." Clara stared at him for several long seconds because she realized then how different Elias Mercer truly was from the men in town. Thomas Grady wanted to replace Daniel. Others wanted Clara to bury him completely. Elias never asked for either. He simply made space for grief without trying to erase it. That frightened Clara more than pressure ever had because it felt safe. Safe enough to lower walls she spent years building. Outside, wind howled harder against the windows while snow swept sideways across the valley. Clara rose quietly from the table to add another log to the fireplace when sudden voices drifted faintly from outside near the road. Male voices. Drunken. Laughing. She froze instantly. Elias stood at the same moment, calm but alert. The voices grew louder briefly before fading again down the road toward town. Clara exhaled shakily. "Probably men leaving the saloon," Elias said quietly. Clara nodded, though unease lingered in her chest. Daniel used to check the doors every night during storms. Elias glanced toward the front entrance. Without a word, he crossed the room and secured the latch more firmly against the wind before returning to his chair. "Small thing," Simple thing. Yet Clara watched him the entire time, with something painfully close to longing tightening beneath her ribs. The realization terrified her. She turned quickly back toward the fireplace before he could read it on her face. "Clara," Elias said softly after a long silence. She looked toward him slowly. Firelight flickered across his weathered features while snow battered the windows behind him. "You do not have to choose between missing him and letting yourself care about somebody still standing in front of you." The room fell completely still. Clara felt tears burn instantly behind her eyes because those words reached the exact place she had spent months trying not to examine. She opened her mouth to answer, but no sound came out, because the truth sat there already waiting inside her chest. Somewhere between storms, lantern light, and quiet evenings beside the porch, Clara Whitmore had begun fearing one thing more than grief itself. She had begun fearing the day Elias Mercer might stop knocking on her door. The church social arrived the following Saturday beneath a sky the color of cold iron. Snow still covered most of Black Hollow, though wagon paths had finally reopened after days of hard weather. Lanterns glowed warm through the church windows while music drifted softly into the frozen night air. Normally, Clara Whitmore avoided gatherings like this whenever possible. Crowds exhausted her. Pity exhausted her more. But Martha Reed had appeared at her house that morning carrying cinnamon bread and enough stubbornness to overpower grief itself. "You are coming," Martha declared while hanging her coat by the door. "And before you say no, understand I am too old to drag another grown woman across town in winter." Clara almost smiled despite herself. "You rehearsed that speech, did you not? All morning." So now Clara stood near the back of the church hall wearing the same black dress she had worn nearly every day since Daniel died. Yet tonight something was different. Her hair rested loose around her shoulders instead of tightly pinned. And for the first time in years, she had left the house without feeling like a ghost wandering among the living. Conversations drifted warmly through the crowded room. Children chased each other between tables stacked with pies and roasted potatoes, while older men argued over cattle prices near the stove. Yet despite the laughter filling the hall, Clara still felt eyes following her everywhere she moved. Not cruel exactly. Curious. Careful. The widow who had finally started living again had become the town's favorite unfinished story. "You came." Clara turned at the familiar voice. Elias Mercer stood near the doorway brushing melted snow from his coat sleeves while lantern light flickered softly across his weathered face. He looked uncomfortable already. Crowded rooms did not suit him. "Martha threatened me," Clara admitted quietly. "Said she would shame me publicly if I stayed home again." Elias nodded once. "Sounds like Martha." Silence settled gently between them while music played softly near the front of the hall. Clara noticed several townspeople watching them openly now. She lowered her eyes slightly. "Perhaps we should stand farther apart before half the county faints." Something faintly amused touched Elias's expression. Too late for that. Before Clara could answer, Thomas Grady's loud voice carried suddenly across the room near the punch table. "Well now," he called with a grin too sharp to be friendly. "Looks like winter finally thawed our widow after all." Several conversations quieted immediately. Clara felt heat rise beneath her skin while tension tightened through the room. Elias remained perfectly still beside her. Thomas approached slowly, expensive boots clicking against the wooden floorboards while whiskey confidence drifted ahead of him like smoke. "Evening, Clara," she answered calmly. "Mr. Grady." Thomas glanced toward Elias with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Mercer." Elias gave one short nod. "Nothing more." Thomas chuckled softly. "You know, folks have started taking bets on this whole arrangement." Clara's expression hardened slightly. "I was not aware my life had become entertainment. Small towns need hobbies." His eyes moved back toward Elias. "Though I will admit, I underestimated you, Mercer. Never figured you for the patient type." The room had gone nearly silent now except for distant piano music near the front of the hall. Clara felt humiliation creeping slowly through her chest. Same feeling she carried the night Thomas mocked her before everyone months ago. Only now it hurt differently because Elias stood beside her hearing every word. Thomas stepped closer. "Tell me something honestly," he continued casually. "You sitting on her porch every night because you love her?" Clara's breath caught. The question landed heavily in the center of the room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the piano faltered uncertainly before stopping altogether. Elias looked at Thomas steadily, without visible anger. That your business? Thomas shrugged. Maybe not. But if a man spends months courting a widow, folks eventually expect him to either mean something by it or stop wasting her time. Clara felt her pulse hammer painfully beneath her ribs. She should walk away. She knew that. Yet her feet remained frozen to the floorboards. Because somewhere deep inside, part of her feared the answer too. Elias remained silent several long seconds before finally speaking in that same calm, low voice that somehow carried through the entire church hall without effort. I never came asking Clara Whitmore to stop loving her husband. The room stayed completely still. Elias glanced briefly toward Clara, then back at Thomas. And I never sat beside her expecting payment for kindness either. Thomas forced a dry laugh. That still does not answer the question. Elias studied him quietly. Maybe because you keep confusing love with ownership. A few people shifted uncomfortably nearby. Thomas's smile tightened. Sounds noble. His eyes narrowed slightly. But people do not spend every evening freezing on somebody's porch unless they want something. For the first time all night, something changed in Elias Mercer's expression. Not anger exactly, just exhaustion. Tiredness carved deep by years of watching people mistake gentleness for weakness. He looked toward Clara then, fully this time. And when he spoke again, his voice softened enough that only the nearest people could hear clearly. You want truth. Clara could barely breathe. Elias held her gaze steadily beneath the lantern light. I kept showing up because she looked like somebody carrying grief too heavy for one person alone. Silence wrapped around the room completely now. Clara felt tears burning suddenly behind her eyes. Not because of embarrassment. Because nobody had ever defended her pain without trying to control it afterward. Thomas looked away first, uncomfortable beneath the weight of quiet judgment spreading through the church hall. But Elias was not finished. He turned back toward Thomas slowly. And if you think sitting beside someone through sorrow counts as wasting time, he said quietly, then I feel sorry for every woman who ever trusted you with her heart. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. The entire room seemed to exhale all at once beneath the lantern glow. Thomas's face hardened with humiliation before he muttered something under his breath and disappeared toward the saloon doors without another word. Clara stood frozen beside Elias while emotion tightened painfully through her chest. Around them, conversations slowly began returning in hushed, uncertain murmurs. Yet somehow the room no longer felt hostile. For the first time in years, nobody looked at Clara Whitmore like she was broken beyond repair. They looked at her like a woman somebody had finally chosen to stand beside instead of fix. And standing there beneath warm church lanterns while snow drifted softly beyond the windows, Clara realized something terrifyingly simple. Elias Mercer had stopped feeling like company. Somewhere along the long winter nights, the quiet rancher had become home. The ride home from the church social felt quieter than any evening Clara Whitmore could remember. Snow crunched softly beneath the horses' hooves while lantern light from Black Hollow faded slowly behind them, swallowed by winter darkness stretching across the prairie. Elias Mercer rode beside her without speaking much. He always seemed to understand when silence carried too much weight for words. Yet tonight the quiet between them felt different. Fuller somehow. Like something unspoken had finally stepped into the open air between their hearts. Clara kept replaying his words inside the church hall over and over again. I kept showing up because she looked like somebody carrying grief too heavy for one person alone. No man had ever defended her sorrow without trying to own her afterward. That was what shook her most. Elias never treated pain like weakness. Never demanded she become less haunted to deserve kindness. Snow drifted lazily through the moonlight around them, while distant coyotes called somewhere far across the valley. When Clara's house finally appeared through the darkness, lantern light glowing warm behind the windows, neither moved immediately after stopping beside the porch steps. The world felt still. Winter stillness. Honest stillness. Clara climbed carefully down from her horse while Elias tied the reins loosely near the fence rail. Normally this was the part where he nodded quietly, wished her good night, and disappeared back into the dark road leading toward Cottonwood Ridge. But tonight neither seemed ready for the evening to end. Clara stood near the porch steps, pulling her coat tighter against the cold, while snowflakes melted softly in her dark hair. Elias remained beside the fence for several seconds watching the house. Then finally he spoke. You should probably hate me a little after tonight. Clara frowned softly. For what? He looked toward the distant town lights barely visible beyond snowy hills. Making your private grief the center of a church hall. Clara studied him beneath pale moonlight. You did not embarrass me. Elias gave a dry, faint laugh. Town might disagree. Town spends most evenings inventing stories because their own lives bore them. The corner of his mouth shifted slightly upward again. There it was. That rare almost smile she had started waiting for without admitting it to herself. Clara stepped onto the porch slowly while lantern glow spilled warm gold across the snow around her boots. Then she stopped near the empty chair beside the front door. Daniel's chair. For 3 years nobody touched it except Elias Mercer. And suddenly Clara understood why. Not because she wanted somebody to replace her husband, but because Elias never tried to. The realization moved quietly through her chest like thawing ice after a brutal winter. Elias adjusted his gloves slowly, preparing to leave. You should get inside before the cold settles deeper, he said softly. Clara looked toward the empty porch beside her. Wind stirred gently through the railing while snow continued falling around them in silence. Then before fear could stop her, she spoke. Stay a while longer. Elias paused completely still. Clara felt her pulse quicken beneath her coat, because those 3 words carried more truth than anything else she had said in years. Not politeness. Not obligation. Want. Simple and terrifying. Elias climbed the porch steps slowly, boots creaking softly against frozen wood. Clara sat down first near the lantern while he lowered himself carefully into the chair beside hers. The same chair the entire town once treated like sacred ground no living soul should disturb. Yet tonight, it no longer felt haunted, just occupied. They sat quietly listening to wind move across the snow-covered prairie. No music, no church crowd, no gossip, just 2 lonely people beneath winter stars trying to understand what had slowly grown between them over months of shared silence. After a while, Clara spoke softly into the cold air. I was angry at Daniel after he died. Elias turned slightly toward her, but did not interrupt. Not at first, she continued quietly. At first I only missed him. Her eyes lowered toward her hands folded tightly in her lap. But eventually, I became angry he left me here alone to carry all this. Tears burned gently behind her eyes though her voice stayed calm. Then I hated myself for being angry at someone I loved. Elias listened the way he always did. Fully, carefully. Like her pain deserved patience instead of fixing. Samuel used to tell me grief is just love with nowhere left to go, he said quietly after a while. Clara looked toward him slowly. Your brother said that? Elias nodded once. Smartest thing he ever said. Clara stared out toward the snowy fields beyond the porch while those words settled softly inside her chest. Love with nowhere left to go. Maybe that was why sorrow exhausted people so deeply. Not because love disappears after loss. Because it stays, with nowhere to land. Wind rattled softly against the porch railing. Elias shifted slightly in his chair before speaking again. For what it is worth, Clara glanced toward him. He hesitated briefly. Strange. Elias Mercer rarely seemed uncertain about anything. I do not think Daniel would hate you for surviving him. Clara's breath caught painfully. You cannot know that. No, he admitted quietly. But I know what it feels like watching somebody you love carry guilt they were never meant to keep. Silence wrapped gently around them. Clara realized then how much of Elias's kindness came from his own loneliness, his own losses. He understood sorrow because he had survived it too. And somehow surviving pain, without growing cruel afterward, felt like the rarest kind of strength she had ever seen. The lantern beside them flickered softly in the cold wind while snow continued falling steady across the valley. Clara's gloved hand rested quietly on the arm of her chair, inches away from his. Such a small distance. Yet it felt larger than the prairie itself. She stared at that space for several long seconds before finally letting her fingers move slowly across the wood until they touched the back of his hand. Barely. Light as snowfall. Elias froze softly beside her. Not pulling away. Not reaching for more. Just still. Respectful. Careful with her heart the same way he had been careful from the beginning. Clara swallowed hard against the emotion tightening her throat. I forgot what it feels like not to be alone all the time, she whispered. Elias turned his hand slightly beneath hers, enough to let warmth remain there without trapping it. You were never meant to carry winter by yourself forever. Tears slipped quietly down Clara's cheeks then, But for the first time in years, they did not feel born entirely from grief. Some tears come from relief, from exhaustion, finally finding somewhere safe to rest. And beneath the pale winter moon outside Black Hollow, Clara Whitmore realized the quiet rancher beside her had done something no one else ever could. He had sat beside her sorrow long enough for hope to return without asking permission. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Black Hollow after that night. Snow began melting from rooftops in long silver drips beneath warmer sunlight, and muddy wagon tracks slowly returned to the roads cutting through the valley. The prairie remained pale and sleeping beneath the cold, but somewhere underneath, spring had already started breathing quietly again. Clara Whitmore noticed the change first in small things. Birds returning to fence posts near dawn, the smell of wet earth replacing sharp ice in the wind, and most of all, the strange, unfamiliar peace settling inside her chest each evening when Elias Mercer's horse appeared on the road. He still came every night just before sunset, still knocked only once, still sat beside her for hours without demanding anything from her heart she was not ready to give. But now the silence between them no longer felt wounded. It felt lived in, safe. Some evenings Clara read old newspaper stories aloud while Elias repaired harness straps beside the fire. Other nights, they simply sat on the porch listening to wind move through the fields while the world softened around them. Black Hollow noticed the difference too. People stopped whispering quite so cruelly when Clara rode through town. Martha Reed nearly cried the first morning Clara entered the bakery wearing dark blue instead of black. "Look at you," Martha whispered softly, pressing flour-covered hands against her chest. Clara lowered her eyes with embarrassment. "It is only a dress." Martha smiled sadly. "No, honey. It is the first sign you decided surviving is not betrayal." Those words stayed with Clara long after she left the bakery carrying warm bread beneath one arm. Because for the first time in years, she no longer woke every morning feeling guilty for still being alive. Daniel Whitmore remained part of her. Always would. But grief no longer felt like chains wrapped around her ribs. It had become memory instead. Tender. Sad. Human. One warm evening near the beginning of spring, Clara stood alone inside the bedroom she once shared with Daniel while golden sunset light spilled softly across the floorboards. Dust floated lazily through the quiet room. For several minutes, she simply stared at the old wooden wardrobe against the wall before finally walking toward it with trembling hands. Inside hung rows of black dresses untouched for years. Funeral black, mourning black, widow black. Clara touched the sleeve of one slowly before closing her eyes. "I loved you," she whispered softly into the empty room. "I will always love you." Tears filled her eyes, but they came gently now. Not sharp, not drowning. Then she opened the bottom drawer and removed a folded blue dress she had not worn since before Daniel died. Simple, soft blue cotton with tiny pearl buttons near the collar. She stared at it for a long while before carrying it downstairs. Elias arrived shortly before sunset that evening. As always, one calm knock, one quiet step onto the porch. But when Clara opened the door, he froze completely still. She stood before him wearing the blue dress beneath warm lantern light, her dark hair loose around her shoulders while spring wind drifted softly through the open doorway behind her. For several seconds Elias said nothing at all. Clara suddenly felt shy beneath his gaze. "It has been sitting in a drawer for years," she said quietly. Elias looked at her like a man seeing sunrise after a very long winter. "Blue suits you." Such a simple sentence. Yet it reached deeper than poetry ever could. Clara stepped aside, letting him enter while evening settled golden and soft across the prairie outside. Later they sat together on the porch beneath the fading sunset, two coffee cups steaming gently beside them while crickets sang through newly thawed grass. The empty chair beside Clara no longer looked haunted now. It looked occupied exactly the way it was always meant to be. Elias leaned back quietly, eyes resting on the horizon while warm wind moved through the valley carrying the scent of spring rain somewhere far away. After a long silence, Clara finally spoke. "I used to think love only happened once." Elias glanced toward her. She lowered her eyes toward her hands resting in her lap. "When Daniel died, I thought the rest of my life would just be surviving what remained." Wind moved softly through the porch railing. "Then you kept showing up." Elias studied her quietly beneath the fading light. You gave me somewhere to put all the grief that had nowhere left to go." His expression softened almost painfully at those words. Clara looked toward him fully then, no fear left inside her eyes anymore. "And somehow," she whispered, "you made life feel warm again without asking me to forget who I lost." Silence settled gently around them, while the last light of sunset painted gold across the hills beyond Black Hollow. Then slowly, carefully, Elias reached for her hand resting beside the lantern. This time Clara did not hesitate. Their fingers folded together naturally like two lonely roads finally meeting after years apart. No grand speeches followed. No dramatic promises. Just quiet understanding beneath a spring sky slowly darkening above the prairie. Somewhere down in town, church bells rang softly through the evening air. Clara rested her head lightly against Elias's shoulder while wind moved warm through the fields around them. And for the first time since Daniel Whitmore disappeared beneath floodwater years ago, the house no longer felt like a monument to sorrow. It felt like home again. Folks in Black Hollow would later say the strangest part of the whole story was not that the widow eventually loved again. It was that the quiet rancher never once tried rescuing her from grief. He simply sat beside it long enough for her to remember she was still alive beneath all the sorrow. Out west, people think courage belongs to men carrying guns or riding into danger. But sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stay. Stay through silence. Stay through winter. Stay long enough for another soul to believe warmth might still exist in the world. And on quiet evenings in Black Hollow, if lantern light glowed softly from Clara Whitmore's porch just after sunset, folks no longer whispered about ghosts living there. They spoke instead about the lonely rancher who asked for nothing except permission to sit beside a grieving woman until her heart remembered how to beat without pain. Thanks for watching this story. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Tell me in the comments what you felt about this story and what kind of stories you want to see next. See you in the next story.